So we've been talking about sin over the past couple days. It's not exactly the most cheerful of subjects, but we're going to have one more day. I feel like this is a really important one that sometimes we overlook, and that's this idea of generational sins. So if you're completely unfamiliar with this phrase, a generational sin is something that is passed down from parents to child to grandchild and so on. A super easy explanation of that would be something like, well, the grandpa was alcoholic, and then the kid was alcoholic, then he grew up and his kid became an alcoholic. That's one of the kind of easier ones to spot, but there are a lot of others too. And there are different roots. Sometimes it's just learned behavior. If your parent grew up with a parent who lost his temper or lost her temper all the time, they learned to lose their temper. And so now they lose their temper, and then their kids are learning to lose their temper. So sometimes generational sins are just you learn them by example. Sometimes I think there's also a genetic component. Like I know I have a genetic predisposition to struggle with depression. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a sin of mine, but or a sin in general. How I respond to it can be sinful, and sometimes I do respond to it sinfully. But knowing that it's in my genetic makeup kind of can be one of these generational patterns, not always. And then sometimes I think it's a lot more spiritual. Like maybe you had someone in your family history who was part of the occult. And so every so many generations, for example, there might be someone else who struggles a lot more with spiritual oppression than a typical person would, or things like that. I was reading about how Japan has a super high suicide rate, and I know there are tons of reasons, but I think there's a spiritual reason. It goes all the way back to the time of the samurai, who would show honor by committing suicide. And I think that those kinds of things do have a spiritual influence as well that's harder to see. So sometimes it's very obvious what your generational sins or struggles might be, and sometimes you might need prayer for discernment because it might not be as clear. But let's be praying for our husband's generational sins. And I'm not even saying that everybody has a generational sin, but if nothing's coming to mind, I would say ask God, is there a generational sin I haven't noticed? And if not, maybe you can just kind of be praying that would be the legacy. So instead of a sin legacy, there could be a legacy like, I think I counted back, I come from like 4 or 5 generations of missionary women, which I think is an amazing legacy. So maybe your prayers can be more positive for a better legacy for your husband than any kids that you guys have, and grandkids and all of that too. And just one more reminder, while we're praying for our husbands, it's important for us to be praying for ourselves too. It guards us against feeling hoity-toity, like, oh, my husband struggles with this, when we remember there are things that we struggle with too. And it's also just a good idea to be praying for yourself also. So I'm going to read from Exodus 20. This is when God is telling Moses and the Israelites the 10 Commandments. And I didn't realize that this was from the 10 Commandments. I've heard this verse, but never put it together, or at least had forgotten that it's connected. But this is where one of our ideas of generational sins comes from, is this passage. You shall not bow down to them, speaking of idols, or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd or 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my command. So again, maybe you snap of the finger, know what patterns your husband struggles with, maybe something that he learned from his parents, maybe it's deeper and has more spiritual roots. Or maybe it's worth praying and exploring to see if either you or him are falling under these same habits as your ancestors. And then one more layer of prayer is if you are a parent, or if you hope to be a parent one day, you can be thinking about sins that are passed down, and also sins that you don't want to be passed down. Like I know I can struggle a lot with like emotional eating and binge eating. And so I pray not only for deliverance from that, but also that God would protect my kids from kind of inheriting that sin pattern. That's another important prayer. So like if your husband has a struggle with X, Y, or Z, you can be praying that wouldn't be passed down, that the pattern of generational sin would be broken right then. That's another important prayer. So speaking of prayer, let's go ahead and do that. God, I pray that you would bring to mind any generational sin, either in my life or my husband's, that needs to be broken. I pray that even recognizing the generational sins or these generational patterns would bring freedom. I pray that we could leave a legacy for our children and grandchildren, or even any of our spiritual descendants, of a pure walk with you and pure obedience, God. I pray that we leave a positive legacy. I pray that you would help my husband to see how certain patterns may have been passed down from his parents, and that you would help him to set a better example for future generations, Lord. Amen.